Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be looking at what the Black Order can do in PvP, so that's Alliance Conquest and Timeline. I was going to include it in the last video, but it got pretty long with all the PvE stuff that I was talking about. Also, I was going to release this video pretty quickly after the last video, but because Ebony Ma's new uniform NT3 was also coming fairly quickly, I waited a bit to include that into this video as well. Since this is primarily a PvP video, I'm first going to be looking at how the Black Order does in Timeline, specifically how they perform on auto and how you can play them on manual if you wish to do that as well. Then after briefly covering that, I'll look at how the characters perform in Alliance Conquest to give you an idea of how to pair them up, who you can use them against, and what characters you can use to take down the Black Order themselves. And after looking at all that, I'll give you my idea of who I feel is highest on the priority list in terms of uniforms to get, and highest on the priority list for characters to upgrade, so ones that would give you the most value. As you're probably aware by now, all the Black Order are really good, and I would argue that they're all PvP meta. But you obviously don't have to take my word for it, you'll see that in the footage that I got. So enough of the chit chat, let's get into the testing. The first character I'm looking at is Proxima, and I mentioned in the previous video that even though she doesn't have the top skills for a PvP character, so she doesn't have things like iframe, reflect, and other PvP meta skills, her kit lends really well to a PvP build. So what I mean by this is that she has a built-in invincible when she goes under a certain health threshold. Besides that, she also has native penetration in her kit, so she already has, in a way, a built-in CTP of authority or transcendence component into her kit, as well as penetration that you would normally get from a CTP of destruction. In addition to this, her 5th skill provides her with healing, and that passive that gives her the invincible also heals her one time for about 40% health. If you've been paying attention to the footage in the back, you've been noticing that Proxima is absolutely devastating these 3 top revive metas. And to give you an idea of why that is, I'll show you the clip again and discuss the details of it. So the characteristics that I mentioned give Proxima potential for PvP, but what really puts her over the top and makes her really good is her skills and her AI. Her 5th skill is unlike any other in the game really, and is what makes her really good for PvP. It has a short cooldown and about 20% total health recovery on it, and due to the short cooldown, the AI spams it a lot. What makes the skill so amazing though, besides the constant healing, is that the damage is delayed. Even if the character has an iframe ignore or interrupts that 5th skill, the damage is still gonna come regardless. This delayed damage also gives her a lot of burst potential because unlike pretty much any other character in the game, she can stack or layer damage with her other skills that you would normally have to do manually. This 5th skill spam means that she gets her ultimate fairly quickly, and because she iframes a lot and her other skills move her around all over the place, she avoids a lot of damage and has really high survivability. The build that I'm using here is regen, and it's the one that I would advocate the most if you want her as a solo character. The reason I went with regen is because she has high base health, and because of the 5th skill spam, she gets even more health with the recovery from the CTP regeneration, as well as that one-time heal from the passive. If you're wondering about other PvP build ideas, I included them in my last video. Even though it was for PvE, I covered PvP builds there too, and you can find a timestamp of that in the comments. If you want to play her manually, all you really have to do is use your 5th skill and then go into your 3rd skill to continue that iframe, and then into your 2nd skill, and you'll see that the spears will also come down at that point, and you'll have all that burst damage stacking up. So you can clearly see she's pretty good for PvP, but she's really good in Alliance Conquest, and you'll see that soon. The next character that I'm testing here is Black Dwarf, to see if he can solo this team just like Proxima could. And a little spoiler alert, he can. Even though Black Dwarf probably won't be used that much in Timeline, he's still really good. His 5th skill does a lot of damage, and he has that iframe ignore on his 2nd skill, as well as the reflect physical damage. His survival is also really good. He has that passive heal, as well as a lot of health when transcending him, and pretty decently long iframes on his 5th and 4th. You can see if you build him pretty tanky enough, he can easily go into his transcendent skill even in Timeline. So the build that I went with was a regeneration to increase that healing even more, and because he got a chunky 20% health increase on his uniform. Alternatively, you can also use Authority and even Transcendence since he has guard break immunity in his passive. If you want to play him manually, you basically just use the 5th skill and the 4th skill whenever they're off cooldown, and the cooldown is pretty short, so you're going to be in iframes most of the time. If the opponent uses an iframe skill themselves, you always have the option of using your 2nd skill that ignores the iframe. If you watched my previous video, you would have seen that Corvus got a really big damage upgrade with his newest uniform, but aside from that, he didn't get any other meta PvP skills like iframe, ignore, reflect, or so on. However, since he did have revive and they gave him an awakening skill, he's probably one of the best characters to awaken for the value that it gives in PvP content. He probably won't be able to take out the whole team in timeline, but should be able to take out 1 or 2 members on there. In Alliance Conquest, on the other hand, he can take out a full team, which is why that awakening is so useful. Interestingly enough, even though the new uniform gives him a lot of damage for both PvE and PvP, his survival does decrease with the newest uniform, and that's mostly attributed to the duration and frequency of iframes being reduced on his skills. You can see that with the newest uniform, the 3rd skill and the 5th skill have no iframes, and the 4th is only a partial iframe. With the old uniform, the 5th skill is a partial iframe and the 4th isn't. However, the 3rd skill is a full iframe, and even though this might not seem like a big deal, the 3rd skill being an iframe actually is pretty significant because most often, due to the short cooldown, the AI will rotate the 2nd and 3rd skill endlessly, leaving you in full iframes most of the time. You can see the difference this makes in the next test I did where I fought the same team using the old uniform. If you're wondering what build I'm using, I went with the CTP of Destruction since the character has no native penetration, and because most often I'm relying on the character going into their awakening skill and I want the full damage of that skill to apply to whoever I'm fighting. Also, because I've opted to use the old uniform versus the new one for PvP, that universal typing and the fact that he iframes more often lends pretty well to the destruction, since I have the survival aspect covered with iframes and the damage aspect covered with the proc. If you opt to use the new uniform, then a CTP of Authority or Transcendence might actually be a little bit better, since he does lack that survival but has the extra damage. The only negatives here are that the character will be a speed type, so they'll have a hard counter, and you lose that penetration if you were to have gone with the CTP of Destruction instead. But anyways, you can see here that with the old uniform, I was able to beat what I couldn't with the newest one. So based on this test and the ones that I did in Alliance Conquest, I'd say that Corvus's new uniform, for PvP at least, is probably the lowest or the last one on the priority list. All you really need to do is get him awakened, not even transcended, and he'll get a really strong upgrade overall. Supergiant became very good in PvE, but similarly in PvP she also got a very significant upgrade. She has a lot of burst potential on her 4th and 2nd skill, as well as things like healing and mind control in her kit, in addition to an iframe ignore on her 3rd skill. To add to that, her 3rd skill is also a guard break immunity penetration skill, so similar to Jean's 5th skill where she drops the orb on a character. If the 3rd skill hits you, the character will basically get head rocked and locked down. And you can see that in the current clip with Jean just getting held in place. Even though Supergiant can take out most metas, Jean is a hard counter to her because of her high element resistance. You can clearly see that head rocking attribute here, and since the skill is an iframe ignore, it can essentially pluck characters out of their skills and keep them locked down. I use this characteristic to form a pretty interesting team for Alliance Conquest, and you'll see that very soon. In the current clip that I'm showing, I'm demonstrating that the character can indeed take out full teams by herself, as long as Jean obviously isn't on them. And her survival is also pretty good, allowing her to withstand even awakenings from characters like Corvus. This is in part to her gaining invisibility from her passive, so she becomes a lot harder to hit, which is really good because her health is incredibly low and the Transcendence doesn't really add much to it either. Because her health pool is so low and her damage is already pretty good, I decided to go with a CTP of Authority, but again, you could probably make her work with a CTP of Transcendence if you use her often with Black Dwarf, or you could opt for CTP of Destruction to get that extra penetration. For Ma's latest uniform, he has really good damage on his 4th and 5th skill and can essentially kill any meta with those skills, especially if they happen to be universal type, since his newest uniform passive gives him an additional 10% increased damage to those types and 10% reduced damage taken. So that's a total of 35 and 35. Outside of these two skills, the passive and maybe a bit of a heal on the 3rd skill, he didn't get any other very strong qualities for PvP. That said, because the iframes are so long on his 4th and 5th skill and the damage is so good, he's actually pretty good as a solo character. And you'll get a better glimpse of that once I show you what I was able to do with him in Alliance Conquest. There's many ways that you can build Ma, but the one that I personally went with was using a CTP of Authority. He does have a decent enough HP pool where you can use a regeneration, but he doesn't have good healing skills. So I opted for Authority, where I could get accumulation to pump up the damage even higher. Again, like I mentioned, because the 4th and 5th skill are such long iframes, I felt that he could outlast the Invincible from the opponent, where he wouldn't necessarily need penetration. But again, if you wanted to go that route, then a CTP of Destruction could easily work too. Also, you could go with a CTP of Insight, since most often people use him in Timeline as a support. I didn't go this route because if you put Insight on Ebony Ma, then you can't use Molecule Man Lead because he'll cancel out the Insight. You can also opt for a CTP of Greed because his 4th and 5th skill have pretty long lingering damage and multiple skills can benefit from the proc. Also, you can see from the clips that I didn't fight characters like Silver Surfer because the iframes linger for so long that Silver Surfer's counter skill will be up, and by that point Ma doesn't really stand a chance. This is the first team I tested, and it was to see how well Supergiant does versus top metas, including a Reflect meta like Dormammu. This was before I had awakened her, so I used Phyla-Vell as a support, as well as another damage dealer like Nova. As you can see, her survival is really good, and she can iframe and lock down the character from doing their Reflect skill. If you're wondering why I was using Nova on this team, it's because he also has immunity to guard break penetration on his 2nd skill, and since the cooldown on his 2nd skill and Supergiant's 3rd skill are very low, they can effectively lock down an entire team. And what better way to show that than defeating one of the top metas, the Defenders. You might have been thinking that that might have been a fluke, but this team has been very surprisingly consistent versus the Defenders. Even though Supergiant deals mental damage, which can be countered by Jessica Jones's passive, the fact that she can lock down the Defenders is really good because most times Daredevil's 3rd skill will wipe out the entire team. So by using Supergiant and Nova together, they can lock down that team and keep them from doing anything, while another character and Nova can do most of the damage to wipe them out. I've often used Moonstone as the 3rd character since she's a blast type and can counter the combat types, and because she has very high burst damage. In addition to this, Nova is a great fit for this team because his 2nd skill doesn't iframe, so it doesn't trigger Daredevil's 3rd skill. Also, another reason why I use Moonstone is because her 5th skill lingers, so as long as she uses that skill and a character survives, the damage will still be done, and you can see that just in this clip right here. The purpose of this particular fight also highlights how good Supergiant is solo, so you can see that if you transcend her, she obviously gets the benefit of wiping out any character on the 2nd team. Even if the enemy survives the transcendence, Supergiant has more than enough survival and damage to finish off the fight. To put into perspective how well this team worked for me, I also fought them against other metas, including Hulk and Sentry, and you can clearly see how quickly they dispatched the enemy team. So by providing a debuff lead and the ability to lock down characters as well as counter the Defenders, this easily secures the spot for Supergiant being in the meta for PvP, at least for Alliance Conquest, and I'm sure I've seen a lot of people use her in Timeline as well, especially in Challenger League, so yeah, she's really good. Because the Defenders is a top meta team, then any character that can counter that team almost automatically becomes a meta character. In the case of Black Dwarf, because he has that physical immunity leadership and because he gained the physical reflect, then he instantly becomes meta because he can counter the Defenders. The team that I've had the most luck with was using 2 blast types in combination with his leadership. Iron Man is a particularly good choice with his newest uniform, since when the enemy attacks Black Dwarf, they'll take damage from the reflect, and the lower their health is, the more damage that Iron Man will do from his uniform passive. The other character that I use is Doctor Strange, since he can provide CC effects, the iframe ignore, as well as remove buffs from the enemy. And you can see from the 2nd clip that even if the 2 characters that you accompany Black Dwarf with don't survive, he is capable of soloing the Defenders team by himself, and if you have him awakened, he can easily wipe out the 2nd team as well. To further emphasize how good the character is, I decided to throw a kind of random team versus some top metas to see how he would do. I sped the clip up a bit because it's kind of long, but it does show that he is capable of surviving strong skills from top metas like Sentry's 5th skill, as well as abilities from Null and other characters. You can kind of get a sneak preview of how good Proxima is in Alliance Conquest, since she was able to survive Black Dwarf's Awakening skill and was even the last to die. You might also be wondering what characters you can use to counter a Black Order team. And the one that I used was Black Dwarf as leadership, and then Doctor Strange again to provide the CC, remove buffs, and the iframe ignore. And Apocalypse because he deals energy damage, he isn't countered by the opponent Black Dwarf, and because he's a combat type and can counter Corvus's new type, which is speed. On top of that, Apocalypse's decoys can make Proxima's spears hit them, so you can avoid all that damage. And because he often spams his first skill, and it's a long iframe, and I believe it has good skill priority, meaning it'll hit over other characters who use this skill at the same time. He can catch Proxima out of her abilities and chip her down and then finish her off. For Corvus, he's basically a meta character because of his revive and awakening skill mechanic. He's essentially like a Warriors of the Sky, but bundled into one package. Most of the tests that I did were using the old uniform because I didn't have as much luck with the newest one. The old one performed much better for me, and because it's a universal type, there's no disadvantage versus any of the characters. You can see that even with the old uniform, if you go with the damage proc, then you don't have any trouble taking out top metas. Unless the second team has physical reflect, Corvus doesn't have any trouble wiping them out. If they do have physical reflect though, you might have some trouble because Corvus doesn't necessarily stay in his iframe when he does his awakening skill. More often than not, you'll wipe out the second team without any issue at all. Besides using him to take out metas that don't have iframe ignore skills, you can also use him as a one-man Warrior of the Sky team to counter Warriors of the Sky. All you really need is good leadership. The one that I went with is Wong, which provides the physical immunity from characters like Sunbird and Shadow Shell, so it'll make you immune to 2/3 of the team. And a support can give you that extra damage to burst them down quickly and wipe them out before they start going into their own awakening skills. Another really interesting tactic that you can use with Corvus is you can put him on a team with a character that you want to protect. In a way, it's not really a big deal if Corvus dies, because if he dies quickly, then he'll be able to wipe out the other team very quickly and protect your meta team. So I'm showing this clip again, but you can see that for offense purposes, Corvus's awakening skill is really good because I basically have that Warriors of the Sky effect loaded into one character, and I can use that to defend my meta character, which in this case was Proxima. Speaking of Proxima, like I mentioned previously, she is hands down one of the best PvP metas, at least for Alliance Conquest. Of all the meta characters that I was able to test against, she basically had no difficulty taking out any of them. Her survival is amazing, and her damage is really good even with no damage proc at all. In the first test, I was being a bit conservative and fighting a Jean and Thanos, and also had a decent leadership with a Nimrod on the team. But in the second test, I dialed it up and basically went for a full solo, and as you can see, she was more than capable of doing it. Sentry did get kind of close, but the fact that Proxima can hang with these characters and even beat them is impressive just on its own. And if you thought I was exaggerating about the characters that I was taking out with Proxima, here's another team with 3 metas, 2 of which have iframe ignore and reflect. So you previously saw me pair Ebony Maw with Proxima when his newest uniform wasn't out yet, so I obviously had to try what the team would work like with the newest uniform. I tested this team versus a lot of metas, and it's honestly really good and can take out the majority of the top meta teams. Maw and Proxima basically charge each other up with their passives, and Nimrod gets supercharged up with both of the passives from those 2 characters. So besides Null and Sentry, another top team that you can take out with this set is Jean and Hulk. Nimrod gets a huge buff against Jean because she's a mutant type and he gets all those passive buffs. And because Maw is a blast type now, he has a big advantage versus Hulk. Oftentimes, Hulk is paired in Alliance Conquest with universal types like Sentry, Silver Surfer, and Jean. And Maw is a great counter to those because he's a blast type that counters Hulk, and he has that universal buff versus those leadership characters who are universal. Since you saw how good Proxima is, you might be thinking that she's probably doing all the heavy lifting in this fight and that Maw isn't really doing much, but that is not the case, and you'll see that with the next clip. To emphasize just how good Ebony Maw is in PvP, specifically Alliance Conquest, you see here that I only use a leadership and a support, and he can take out Sentry and a Thanos without much trouble at all. So if you're thinking that he wasn't really designed for PvP, then these clips should convince you otherwise. He is definitely a PvP meta because he's a staple in Timeline, and he can do some pretty good work in Alliance Conquest as well. If you're wondering how to pair the Black Order together, I would highly recommend using Black Dwarf leadership with Proxima and Corvus. You can see that I used the newest uniform for Corvus where he becomes a speed type, and that's okay if you pair him with Black Dwarf because he provides that physical immunity which gives him the extra survival that he lacks, especially if the opponent tries to use a combat or a physical type to counter him. Regardless, Corvus will more than likely be the first to die, which like I mentioned previously is okay because he will go into his Awaken skill, and on offense he can wipe out the entire enemy team. On defense he'll just make it even tougher for the opponent to beat Proxima and Black Dwarf. Again, you can get a better idea of just how good these characters are since this final test that I did was actually one of the first tests that I did before I got these characters awakened and T3'd. So hopefully this made it clear that all of the Black Order are quote-unquote meta for some kind of PvP content, whether that's Alliance Conquest or Timeline. If you're wondering what priority to get the Black Order uniforms in, my suggestion would be to get Supergiants first because it makes her into a really good and standalone functional character that can take out the defenders. Then I would go with Proxima's uniform second because she becomes a meta killer, she's very hard to kill, and she gives you a support passive for your other villain characters. Third, I would go for Black Dwarf's newest uniform since he gets that reflect and because he becomes so strong that he can essentially solo the defenders as well. After that, I would put Maz fourth since he gets that extra boost to his passive, which isn't necessarily essential, but he can be basically a solo PvP character with that uniform. Corvus's, honestly, you can probably skip because all you really need is his awakening and he can do a lot of work even without the uniform. On the other hand, in terms of upgrades, I would go for Corvus first if you're just going to awaken a character because you get so much value from that awakening working with that revive mechanic. After that, T3 Proxima because she becomes even harder to kill and she doesn't need necessarily a damage proc to take out even tougher enemies because of that increased damage from the stat bump. Honestly, for third, you can either go with Supergiant or Black Dwarf. Either of them are just as good, but you might get a little bit more value from Supergiant since she has the debuff leadership and you can put her on all kinds of teams. If you're going to transcend any of these two characters or even any of the three characters that can be transcended, then Black Dwarf is immediately at the top of the list because he gets the biggest stat bump of the three. Ebony Maw doesn't really need his T3 for PvP. It basically just gives him more health and more damage, but his fourth and fifth already do so much damage that he can take out top metas even without being T3. Anyways, that wraps up this video. I was going to include Ebony Maw's PvE performance in it, but I felt like it might be better just to put that in its own video since this is all PvP content in this one. If you're interested to see how much better his uniform and upgrade makes him, then make sure to check out the next video. Anyways, I hope you liked the video and found it entertaining or useful. If you did, then liking or subscribing definitely helps my channel grow and bring you more of this content. If you have any questions or comments, then leave them down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. But yeah, thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.